Thanks to a judge's decision, federal workers will have the rest of the weekend to decide whether to take President Donald Trump's buyout offer.
The deadline was originally supposed to be yesterday, but now U.S. District Judge George O'Toole Jr. will consider Trump's initiative in a fuller hearing Monday.
The buyout program is part of Trump and tech billionaire Elon Musk's effort to shrink the size of government. In exchange for resigning, workers who accept the offer may get 8 months of pay and benefits, not have to show up to work, and would be free to explore other job options.
But 3 unions have sued the Trump administration over the plan. The unions argue that that plan is arbitrary and capricious in their words, and that it violates federal law. As of now, more than 60,000 employees have apparently taken the offer.
Here's Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt commenting on the matter in late January.
The union that represents federal workers, though, says this isn't a voluntary buyout. They say this is a purge of people that don't agree with the president. Well, what's your response?
That's absolutely false. This is a suggestion to federal workers that they have to return to work. And if they don't, then they have the option to resign. And this administration is very generously offering to pay them for 8 months. 6% of the federal workforce in the city actually shows up to work. That's unacceptable.
Others, however, are pushing back and raising the alarm.
He's tricked hundreds of people with that offer. If you accept that offer and resign, he'll stiff you just like he stiffed the contractors. He doesn't have any authority to do this. Do not be fooled by this guy. You were here before he was here, and you'll be here after he was here.
In 1995, Bill Clinton actually offered buyouts to help reduce the federal workforce by about 273,000 people. He even had his own DOGE-style initiative with Al Gore at the head. Clinton released a statement during his time in office on the matter, saying, "For too long in Washington, we have had too many layers of bureaucracy, too many workers whose main job was to check on the work of other workers rather than to perform useful work themselves." As the National Performance Review noted, "We had good people trapped in bad systems. I promised to cut the workforce, and that's what I'm doing."
Berkeley professor and former Secretary of Labour Robert Reich wrote on X, "To America's 2.3 million federal employees, don't accept a buyout. Neither Musk nor even Trump has the legal authority to make such an offer. And even if they did, would you trust them to follow through on it?"
Author and podcaster Kira Davis said, "The federal jobs buyout isn't a threat, it's a mercy. Trump is giving questionable people a chance to get out before they get found out."
So there's so many different elements to this, Amber. I mean, there's a question about the desirability of reducing the federal workforce for a start. But one thing that I'm curious as to whether we find any measure of common ground on is this idea that Congress has appropriated money to keep the workforce up and running. It has not provided money for this buyout, but Trump has decided that there will be that buyout. Does that give you any pause from a kind of a constitutionalist perspective?
Yeah, I'm not sure what the legal parameters are here, to be honest with you, but my instinct would be that because Congress has appropriated money for a specific number of jobs in the executive, doesn't necessarily, that it would be weird to me that the executive would not have the power to fire employees, to add employees as needed, so long as they are staying within the bounds of the budget provided to them by Congress.
Yeah, I wonder about that. I know later in the show we're going to talk about USAID, which has obviously been essentially collapsed. I mean, we'll get into this in more depth, but it has gone from a 5-figure workforce to about 200 or 300 people. Now, Congress must have appropriated the funds to keep that department going at a far bigger staffing level, which has now been removed. That process seems to be playing out across the government at large. We certainly hear speculation that the Department of Education will be the next one in Elon Musk and President Trump's crosshairs. And I do wonder about the power to do it. And I think that feeds into the legal case that we're talking about, because obviously part of that is, does Trump have the actual power to use the money that he has promised people for buyouts? And if there's even a question mark over that, obviously people are going to be more reluctant to take the buyout if they're not assured of the payments.
And sure, and if you compare that to Bill Clinton getting nearly 250,000 employees to leave the federal workforce compared to 60,000 so far who have taken the Trump buyout, I think that suggests that people are a little bit wary about it. I've talked to people who are career employees in the federal government who don't have any intention of leaving, but talking to their coworkers about the buyout, all of them have been a little bit skeptical. But I do agree with the underlying premise that this is very generous, right? I mean, this is an alternative to possibly getting fired if you're someone who has been caught trying to subvert the president's agenda, for example. So instead of getting, canned with nothing, you get 8 months of pay and a free vacation.
Yes, except your hypothetical assumes that people have been caught subverting the president's agenda as opposed to just doing their job regularly and getting caught in the targets of somebody who wants to vastly undermine the scale of the federal government.
Maybe. I mean, either way, the executive has the power to decide who works for them, right?
Well, it does, and that gets us to the policy element of it, which I suspect we will pretty vigorously disagree on, because obviously Trump was elected in part to reform the federal government, and there's no question about that. But the wisdom of doing that in many ways seems fairly questionable to me when you look at some elements or some agencies that suffer from actual staffing shortages. So in the case of the VA, for example, the Inspector General had a report last year, almost 3,000 VA medical facilities across the country were suffering a shortage of staffing, of operational staffing. This, I'm not going to go through every department, of course, but the Social Security Administration serves about 72 million people and has recently been at a 25-year low in terms of staffing levels. And the average wait for help on the phone, if you phone the SSA, is 45 minutes. So when that is the status quo, the wisdom of making these kind of scything cuts seems very dubious to me.
I suppose that my reaction to that is, do higher levels of staffing necessarily ensure greater government efficiency? And I just don't agree with that fundamental premise. I mean, if we go back to comparing this to the private sector, for example, Elon Musk was roundly mocked for buying Twitter, and there was this massive media narrative that he was going to tank the profitability of the company. He comes in, he fires about 80% of the people who work there, saying that they're redundant, that they're not doing their jobs, they're a waste of money. And everyone thought, how the heck is Twitter going to run with only 20% of the staff? And in their most recent charts, they've actually shown that Twitter is making a greater profit than it did before Elon Musk bought it. So I don't think it's necessarily the amount of people that you have, but whether the people you do have are doing their job effectively.
I think that in the abstract is true, but I would say two things. Firstly, on the X example, according to Fidelity Investments, they figure that the actual worth of Twitter X has fallen massively during Musk's ownership. I agree, actually, that some of the media coverage was excessive or hyperbolic or overly excitable, but I'm not convinced that his record is as good as you're presenting it as being. But the other bigger point, I think, and here we do disagree, is that the government isn't a private company. The government's function is not purely to make profit, as is the case with private companies. And part of the government's role is to provide essential services that may, in fact, be very unprofitable, may cost a lot of money to furnish to people. And if that goal is being impeded by staffing shortages, then I don't know why we're trying to make those staffing shortages a lot more severe.
Yeah, I guess my point is not that the government should necessarily operate as a private company trying to make profit, but that sometimes you can do less with more. Mm-hmm. And I would also say that so far we haven't seen Trump making significant cuts to the VA or other what he considers really key services. It's more about trying to root out waste, fraud, and abuse. And so this is a targeted calling of the federal bureaucracy, not targeted at direct payments to Americans, not targeted at Medicare and Medicaid, things like that. And this was another sort of false thing that was propagated by the media almost immediately after Trump took office, was when he instituted that freeze on all government spending, right? Or all government payouts. They claimed that people weren't going to be able to get their food stamps, that they weren't going to be able to get their SNAP cards, that they weren't going to be able to access their Medicare or Medicaid. And very quickly they said, actually, it says directly in the executive order that all direct payments to Americans who are reliant on a safety net are exempt from this order. So I'm very suspicious now of any claims that are made about the way Trump is actually engaging in cutting down the size of the bureaucracy, because we've seen a lot of misreporting.
Just one thing I would say on that point, Amber, which was the idea, the administration in that instance used the word direct in a very meaningful way, because of course something like Medicaid is not delivered directly by the federal government. It's delivered by the states that get subsidized by the federal government for the provision of it all. But I think this has been a good discussion. I think we could continue, but I think time is probably against us.
Unfortunately, it is, but we have a lot more topics to talk about. And what happens to soft power now that USAID is all but done? That's next on Rising.